Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out to Ohio's winter. It is winter, so thanks for coming out. We appreciate that. I'm Derek. I'm one of the reference librarians here at the Hudson Library Historical Society. A couple quick announcements, and then I'll introduce tonight's speaker. First things first, you've probably heard this before, but please silence your cell phones. We don't want them going off. The next thing is there's two programs that you may be interested in. One might be interested if you're a Cleveland Browns fan. We're going to have Terry Pluto, November 18th, in person, and he's a very prolific writer. He's been here, so we're welcoming him back. He's writing his newest book, Why Can't This Team Fight a Quarterback? So, yes, that'll be quite a show. So please join us November 18th at 6:30. It's in person. Another in person at the end of the month on the 25th. At 6:30, we have independent film director and novelist John Sayles, and he's going to be talking about his newest book, To Save a Man, a Novel. So in the back there, we have some flyers. Wish I had a third hand here. Here we go. So we have these. These are for November. If you're curious about our programs, we print these out every month. Also, you can go online, hudsonlibrary.org. So if you're interested about our programs, check them out there and sign up. In the back there, we have Kate from the Learned Owl, and she'll have copies of the book here that our author is going to talk about. So if you would like a copy, and if you would like a copy to be signed afterwards, our author will sign it. And we will have questions as well. So don't worry if you have any questions. Hold on to them. We'll pass the microphone around, and we'll get to the questions. So without further ado, we will talk about our author, Ryan Cole, and he's going to be talking about The Last Adieu. Mr. Cole is a former assistant to the Indiana governor, Mitch Daniels, and a speechwriter at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. He has degrees in history, journalism from Indiana University. He has written extensively about American history and literature for Wall Street Journal, National Review, The New Criterion, Civil War Times, The American Interest, and the Indianapolis Star. He's also written for Indiana University and the Luminia Foundation, and has served on the staff of the United States Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He's also the author of another book, A Light Horse Harry Lee, The Rise and Fall of a Revolutionary Hero, and he has come to us from Indiana, so let's give him a big welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I am from Indiana, southern Indiana, so I was going to thank you all for coming out in this weather, but this is like late summer for you, right? So, as I just mentioned, I'm a Hoosier, but being here is a bit of a homecoming for me because my father was born and raised in Shaker Heights, and he graduated from Case Western Reserve, which I understand began here in Hudson, and his brothers, my uncles, their wives, my aunts, and their children, my cousins all live in the area, and actually a number of them are here. So I'm really grateful not just for the opportunity to come to discuss my new book, but also to spend some time with beloved family members. Now, about that book. The Marquis de Lafayette was here in Ohio. Not in Hudson, but in the southern part of the state. So you might ask then, the Frenchman who fought for our freedom was here in the frontier? And the answer is yes. But when he reached Ohio, he was no longer a young soldier, but an old hero. He returned to the nation that he helped free nearly 40 years since the end of the American Revolution and his last visit to America. He had come to behold the progress made possible by his sacrifices, to receive thanks for those same sacrifices, and to embrace once more with the men who he had made them with, the last remaining veterans of the American War of Independence. Along the way, he undertook one of the greatest public tours of any private citizen in the history of our country. Apologies to any Taylor Swift fans that are here. And he was met with the grandest celebration it has ever staged and one of the happiest periods it would ever know. Have I piqued your interest at all? Good. This is the story. The Marquis de Lafayette, retired on his farm, waits patiently a better state of things. William Eustace, America's envoy to the Netherlands, writes in 1818. By then, the teenager who had left a pregnant wife, a disapproving family and king, to fight for the freedom of a people he did not know and a land he had never seen, the novice soldier who had grown into a major general, the French nobleman who had embraced America's cause and its Republican values, who had formed a father and son bond with George Washington, was an aging hero from the pages of Plutarch. He was widowed, his health was poor, his finances were a wreck. And whether from his farm, LaGrange, 30 miles southeast of Paris, or seat in the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house in the French Parliament, he despaired over the fate of liberty in France and across Europe. Freedoms, the consolations from the incomplete French Revolution, in which he played an early starring role and then had nearly lost his head, are repealed by the restored Bourbon monarchy. Newly established constitutional governments in Spain and Italy and Portugal are stamped out by the Holy Alliance. But encouragement comes from communications carried across the Atlantic Ocean. They bring testimonials of the success of the experiment in freedom he fought for so long ago. They confirm man's capability of self-government, and they contain vivid descriptions of the incredible progress made possible by it. There are also tender letters from the remaining veterans of the American Revolution. Brother soldiers Lafayette has not seen since his last visit to his adopted country in 1784. They transport Lafayette back in time, and they remind him of the emptying hourglass. Not long after receiving a note full of recollections from Joseph Bloomfield, who, like Lafayette, was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine, he learned of the old soldier's death. We remain but too few survivors of that glorious epic in which the fate of two hemispheres has been decided, Lafayette writes to Marinus Willett, another elderly veteran who he had fought alongside at the Battle of Monmouth. May it be in my power, before I join our departed companions, to visit such of them as are still inhabitants of the United States, and to tell you personally, my dear Willett, how affectionately I'm your dear friend, he writes. Americans took note of Lafayette's fortunes. They were touched by his desire to be with his fellow veterans once more. Papers across the United States published the contents of his letters expressing hopes for a final visit to the country. During the summer of 1823, rumors began to circulate that Lafayette indeed was prepared to embark for friendlier shores. But leaving France is as complicated as reaching America would be sweet. And the old hero won't cut and run. His absence, even for a time, would signal to the forces of reaction a battle abandoned. In February 1824, that battle is, for a time, concluded, and Lafayette is voted out of his seat in the Chamber of Deputies. Just as his enemies in the French government seal his fate, Lafayette's friends in America conspire to revive his fortunes. In February of 1824, Congress passes a resolution formally inviting Lafayette to return to America and offers him the use of a national ship to bring him there. America's minister to France, James Brown, arrives in Paris in the spring with a letter of invitation from President James Monroe. As soon as Brown arrives, as he tells Monroe, Lafayette's heart is now set on a visit to America, where he will reunite with his old brothers, collect the evidence of the superiority of representative government, and bring it back to Europe, delivering a rebuke to the monarchs of the old world. In the months that follow, Brown, the American minister, helped Lafayette arrange his affairs, relieve his debts, and secure passage on a ship, though he politely declines the use of a government ship. On July 13th, the packet ship Cadmus departs with Lafayette, his son George Washington Lafayette, and a new secretary, Auguste Levasseur, destined for New York. But what waits for him across the Atlantic? 13 colonies are now 24 states. home to millions of men and women, stretching from the Atlantic seaboard to the Mississippi River and beyond. The economy, transformed by a second war with Great Britain, crashed in 1819, spreading misery far and wide. Passionate debate over the westward expansion of slavery when Missouri is admitted to the Union intensifies antagonisms between the northern and southern states. These stresses animate, in 1824, a strange presidential election, although when have our presidential elections not been strange? A one-party contest between four men. Party is the Democrat and Republican. The Federalist Party has ceased to be a player at the presidential level and will be out of business by the end of the decade. The candidates are Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, Secretary of the Treasury William Crawford, General Andrew Jackson, and Speaker of the House Henry Clay. Their partisans campaign along sectional battle lines and fight so bitterly that observers wonder if the Union can withstand the contest. In this part of the country, thus far, it is very evident that the sectional had prevailed over the national feeling, a Boston newspaper frets. In Georgia, an observer predicted that the new political tensions, quote, will bury our free governments in irretrievable ruin. A Maine editor commented that the citizens, quote, piping themselves out of breath to the tune of the North and the South sounds too much like the end of liberty to suit our ears. But there was another subtext to this acrimonious election. It was best represented by James Monroe's pending departure from public life. Like every previous president, he had participated in the Revolution, either as a soldier or as a statesman. Whoever succeeded Monroe would be the first of a second generation of Americans to lead the nation. The transition worried citizens, fearful that they might spoil all that their dying fathers and mothers had built. As Americans moved towards the future, they glanced back to their past with a sense of painful nostalgia, of historic homesickness. Accordingly, when, on August 15th, the Cadmus at last reached Staten Island and Lafayette once again stepped on American soil, the timing was auspicious. That afternoon, rain clouds cleared. Lafayette was received by the Vice President, Daniel Tompkins, at his estate, and a giant rainbow appeared, a sign, Lafayette says, of happy omens. The next morning, a flotilla of steamboats carried the newly arrived nation's guest, as he was to be known, to Manhattan. On board, the great reunion commences. As the boats pass citizens standing in the perches of forts, in front of homes, watching, screaming, crying, Lafayette is joined by his old brothers in arms, faces he had last seen half a century ago, but recognized instantly. Among them was Marinus Willett. You remember him a few minutes ago. Lafayette had written to him only a few years before, expressing a wish that they may once again come face to face and embrace, and now they did. They sat down next to one another as the boat approached the city. "Do you remember me at the Battle of Monmouth?" Willett asked. Now Lafayette struggled to hold back tears. When the boat reached the battery and Lafayette stepped off and into the old fortress Castle Garden, the greatest tour in American history commenced. Along the mile journey to City Hall, every building and house was draped with bunting and densely packed. Men shout and huzzah. Women wave their white handkerchiefs. Bells clang, cannons thunder, American flags flutter. Some men even rushed towards the carriage that Lafayette sat in, attempted to unhook the horses and carry him themselves the remaining way to City Hall. Quote, "An entire people at the feet of a man, calling him their father, their benefactor," Lafayette's secretary Levasseur writes, "letting fall on his hands and on his clothes the sweetest tears of gratitude, and then passing into the most lively and joyful delirium. Never has man had such a triumph." The early itinerary is to depart from New York for Boston, which is one of the first cities to extend a formal invitation, return to New York, and then head west towards the national capital by way of New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. There was purposely no rush to reach Washington in order to stress that this was a personal rather than a government-organized visit. On August 20th, he's on his way north to Boston. On the road, which leads along Long Island Sound and into Rhode Island, businesses were closed in anticipation of Lafayette's arrival. If his way did not run through their communities, New Englanders rushed to the ones where it did. If he had departed before they arrived, these same travelers embarked for the next town in hot pursuit. Schools were dismissed and the roads were filled with young boys hoping to catch up with the procession. The line of admirers following it grew so large that the clouds of dust it kicked into the air could be seen for miles on the horizon and choked everyone in its wake. Even the horses pulling Lafayette were reminded of the weight and honor of their task. While a new carriage was being equipped in a Connecticut town, its driver lectured one of its horses. "Behave pretty now, Charlie. You are going to carry the greatest man in the world." In Boston, where spectators sat atop balconies, on fences and trees, perched in windows, thousands of young students arranged in columns waited to greet Lafayette. At a moment of incredible theater, one broke ranks, stepped to Lafayette's carriage where she was held up to slip a crown of laurels over his head. On his return to New York in early September, a small army of artisans and laborers transformed the old fort, Castle Garden, into an amphitheater to host the grandest ball in American history on September 14th. To give an adequate description at any time would be impossible, writes a reporter after the party. Meanwhile, ambitious entrepreneurs in New York and its sister states capitalized on Lafayette mania, launching one of the first nationwide commercializations of a national event. Lafayette badges, uniforms, and canes were available in Virginia. Lafayette umbrellas in Baltimore and Philadelphia. Lafayette hats in Georgia. In Lexington, Kentucky, a tailor invented an innovative jacket for men called the Lafayette. Cut without seams on the back or sides, it supposedly eliminated the gathering of dust and provided a better, longer-lasting fit. I can't confirm that any of that is true, but that's how it was advertised. One New York newspaper, taking note of the Lafayette Gold Rush, mockingly wrote, "Little fruit boys run around our streets with their Lafayette peaches and Lafayette pears. It is amusing in what ways our countrymen and women contrive to get our money." Speaking of money, prices for food are so high before his arrival in Philadelphia that the city suffers a bout of inflation. I guess we would call it laflation. The price of butter jumped from 12 cents per pound to 33. Eggs went from 10 to 20. There were no rooms available in the city or its adjoining districts. Never before had Philadelphia received such a sudden and immense influx of visitors. You would not have recognized Philadelphia, so extraordinary was the change, writes one resident. When he's pulled into town on September 28th, it's in the middle of an elaborately choreographed procession, modeled off the Roman Triumphant, in which the returning general is paraded victoriously to the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill, trailed by the spoils of war, prisoners, treasure. Only this is a far more Republican, lowercase r, spectacle. Lafayette is accompanied instead by the city's militia, its artisans, its printers, its civic societies, and of course, the surviving veterans of the Revolution. And his destination? The old State House, where the room in which the Declaration of Independence was debated and declared is rescued from oblivion and refurbished for his visit. That's right. Before Lafayette's visit, the old State House, what we today call Independence Hall, was slated for demolition numerous times, rescued by the people of Philadelphia, sat idle without a purpose, and in anticipation of his arrival, the assembly room where the Declaration was declared was refurbished. So when we call it Independence Hall, the roots are from Lafayette's visit in 1824. And the same building, which at the time was known as the Old State House, nearly half a century before Lafayette returned in 1824, he had stood there as a 19-year-old when he arrived in Philadelphia as a supplicant. Now he returned as a hero, where he had once been dismissed by a peevish congressman who said, "We don't want any more French soldiers trying to fight in our war." Now he passed under a magnificent arch over a carpeted platform and into Independence Hall. At Baltimore, he landed at Fort McHenry, where Washington's old tents shipped from Arlington wait. When one of the tent's doors opens, Lafayette steps through and into the past. Waiting inside were the aged veterans of the Revolution. Their brows, a reporter wrote, whitened with the snows of age. On October 11th, Lafayette left behind the cheering citizens of Baltimore and advanced towards Washington. There he visits the Capitol, the rotunda of which was completed just in time for his visit. He stops at the home of the president. The elite of Paris, Lafayette's secretary imagines, would not leave the White House without proclaiming, "Dear God, how this sovereign house feels bourgeois." Then, of course, on October 17th, the great set piece of his visit to America, Lafayette's return to Mount Vernon and the visit to the crypt containing the bones of his adopted father, George Washington. He steps into the crypt, and when he reappeared, as one present claimed years later, he was crying like an infant. Newspapers reported that a bald eagle hovered overhead. I can't confirm that either. By now, I think you get the picture that Lafayette's return was an occasion for parades and pageantry and over-the-top celebrations. It was truly a popular culture phenomenon. And like any phenomenon of popular culture, it had its critics, though they spoke in mostly hushed tones. What is our nation in regard to Lafayette? Asked Timothy Pickering, the old veteran of the Revolution. He's entitled to the lasting gratitude and respect of our country for his extraordinary zeal, bravery, and sacrifice in our cause. Nathaniel Greene, however, also a major general, was as much superior for his talents and important services as can well be conceived. What were he living would he think of the current national celebrations? The apotheosis of heroes in ancient times, when to idolatry was the public religion, must cease to excite our wonder. But to reduce the American reaction to Lafayette's return to idolatry does it some injustice. After his visit to Mount Vernon, a grand celebration at Yorktown, Lafayette made his way to Monticello, where he rested for over a week with his old friend Thomas Jefferson. Then he visited James Madison at Montpelier, his home in Virginia. The way there was delayed because of celebrations in Richmond and elsewhere, but also because of the election. The same bitter presidential contest, the one that had portended disunion and ruin, was an object of far less passion after Lafayette had arrived in August. The papers are very barren of news, and in this respect, the arrival of Lafayette has been most timely and fortunate, a New York editor writes. Our party editors were getting too angry upon the presidential question, and we'd become so wearied with these squabbles. On all occasions that we were right glad for a moment relief. Indeed, the same editorial, echoing sentiments that Henry Clay claimed to have heard on the East Coast, argued that Lafayette should even be made vice president. Now, the Frenchman was appalled by the idea, but he was pleased by the comedy his return had inspired amongst Americans. And he surmised that it was not just his presence, but the sight of all the old soldiers of the Revolution which had rallied the nation together in gratitude. I have the satisfaction of thinking that my presence has had a great reconciliatory effect between the two parties. Men who had not spoken to each other for over 20 years are brought together and mutually invited to celebrate us. All because he wrote, "Memories of the Revolution have come back to life." Of course, gratitude towards the old revolutionaries was not quite evenly distributed. This is an interesting Ohio aside. At the end of 1824, Congress awarded Lafayette a gift of $200,000 and a township of land for his services in our revolution. There was a small group of congressmen who actually opposed the national gift for the national guest, and most of them were from Ohio. The most vocal of the group was a congressman from Cincinnati named John Gasley. And he argued that while Lafayette was granted a fortune, many veterans of the Revolution were denied pensions, which is true, and forced to beg for a crust of bread. It was a form of idolatry, not a sincere expression of thankfulness to give Lafayette $200,000 without him proving that he actually needed it. It is national vanity in appearance and national gratitude in name only, Gasley wrote. But his fellow Americans were determined to disprove the old adage that republics are ungrateful, and ended up giving Lafayette the $200,000 and the township of land, which ended up being in Florida. But even gratitude and the power of common memory can't stop American politics. In December 1824, when none of the four presidential candidates won the required 131 electoral votes, as the Constitution's 12th Amendment stipulates, the field was culled to 3, and the presidential election was thrown to the House of Representatives. Partisan passions were quickly revived, and fear of violence and disunion rose once more. John Quincy Adams received threatening letters from supporters of his opponents. Some of Jackson's partisans even threatened to storm the Capitol should their man lose. Lafayette, in the middle of this storm, avoided taking sides and remained optimistic about America. The Europeans, Lafayette observed, flatter themselves in thinking that the constitutional republic will be ripped apart by the violence of the candidates' 3 parties during this moment of passage, from the veterans of the Revolution to the new men. On the contrary, they will see that everything will occur in the most reassuring way. And indeed, when the House elected John Quincy Adams president on February 9th, 1825, the crowds gathered at the Capitol departed peacefully. That evening, at a reception at the White House, Adams and General Jackson graciously shook hands, all with Lafayette looking on. Now, what an incredible story this would be if it just ended right there. But the greatest adventure was still ahead. During a stay in Washington during the winter 1824 and 1825, Lafayette received invitations from the southern and western states. Interestingly, Ohio was not one of them. For some reason, Ohio didn't actually issue a formal resolution of invitation. Lafayette was still determined to come here. He was determined to come to every state he had not visited yet, all the southern states and the western states. So while he waited for winter to pass in Washington, his son and friends in the capital, including many members of Congress, organized an incredible journey. Lafayette and his companions would travel into the American South, reach Savannah, swing over to New Orleans, then travel up into the unknown of the American West. But there was a complication. During his visit to Boston, previous August, Lafayette promised the planners of a possible new monument at Bunker Hill that should he still be in the country the following summer, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, he would attend a celebration there. That meant that Lafayette would have to travel through the South and the West and be back east in Boston by June 17th. That meant traveling 5,300 miles overland and on water. The trip would likely take 99 days and cross into 15 states. Time was of the essence. He skipped Adams' inauguration in March, though of course Lafayette would not miss the celebration of George Washington's birthday on February 22nd in Virginia. The following day, he boarded the steamboat Potomac, descended its namesake river, and the great voyage was underway. For the next 4 months, he traveled by stagecoach and steamboat on primitive roads and dangerous waterways. He rode through the Carolina pine forests by the light of bonfires in the dead of night. He presided over the dedication of monuments to dead heroes, to Cobb and Camden, Greene, Pulaski, and Savannah. He raced steamboats into the port of Augusta. He was pulled onto the shores of the Chattahoochee River by a band of Creek warriors. An Alabama militiaman who was watching from the shore said it was the greatest show of a river crossing he had ever seen. In New Orleans, he saw the heartening spectacle of Frenchmen living under free government. He steamed up the Mississippi into the American frontier, reached St. Louis by the end of April, toured William Clark's Museum of Natural Wonders, came face to face with a young man named William Hamilton, whose father had been an old friend, Alexander Hamilton. In Nashville, he walked arm in arm with General Jackson. On the way to Louisville, he narrowly escaped disaster when a steamboat sank between Indiana and Kentucky on the Ohio River. Now, as a Hoosier, I'm naturally biased, but I think the preamble of our state's invitation to Lafayette is one of the most poetic. It read, "The felicity denied by a curious providence to the father of his country has, it is hoped, been reserved for his adopted son. What the immortal Washington was permitted only to see through the dark vista of futurity will be realized in the fullness of his vision by his associate in arms and glory. Washington had traveled into the Ohio River Valley as an envoy, as a soldier, as a surveyor. He had remarked on the richness of the land, understood the importance of its commercial connections with the East, and its suitability as a spot for settlement. Lafayette, in a sense, now beheld what Washington had anticipated. The shipyards in Jeffersonville, Indiana, the slaughterhouses, distilleries, and factories in Louisville, circus and theater also. In the Athens of the West, Lexington, Kentucky, the seat of Fayette County, named in Lafayette's honor, was Transylvania University, the first college established west of the Allegheny Mountains, chartered by Virginia in 1790. Then it was on to Ohio, the site, Lafayette says, of wonderful improvements of the public happiness, which is gratifying to an American heart. By May 19th, Lafayette had reached Cincinnati, the wonder of the West, the infant Hercules, with its booksellers, shipwrights, stonecutters, and factories. Now, he had originally planned to land in Cincinnati and travel through the interior of Ohio. He was going to go from Cincinnati to Chillicothe, to Columbus, to Lancaster, and then to Zanesville. But he was 6 days behind schedule when he got to Cincinnati. So instead of traveling overland, he had to travel along the river, which meant steaming across the Ohio and then stopping ever so briefly at Gallipolis and Marietta before landing at Wheeling and traveling on the National Road. Heading north through Pennsylvania into western New York, he traveled along that symbol of American ingenuity and engineering might, the Erie Canal. He left the wonder behind, rode nonstop towards Massachusetts, and incredibly reached Boston on June 15th, 2 days ahead of schedule. Over 5,000 miles in carriages and steamboats, barges, and packets, Lafayette had skirted the ocean, crossed one great river, wrecked on another, rode through forests and into the frontier, sailed along the Great Canal. He'd obliged almost every invitation, shook thousands of hands. He memorialized his dead brothers, and he made history by simply pausing for an hour in communities that will remember his visit centuries later. No public person has ever successfully attempted such an endeavor. 2 mornings later, on the 17th, he met with the surviving veterans of Bunker Hill. One interloper caught a glimpse of the soldiers. Their faces and frames seemed to have been made of iron. At 10 a.m., a procession formed outside the Massachusetts State House. Half an hour later, it moved towards Charlestown, passing 20,000 spectators who had converged on Boston from all parts of the Union. The crowds were so dense that the sidewalks and window frames were filled to capacity. Churches were open to accommodate the overflow crowds. Some climbed onto chimneys. Others rented trees for $500. At the front of the line were the militia. Behind them marched 40 veterans of the Battle of Bunker Hill. Those who were able went on foot. Others, having surrendered to the ravages of time, were carried back to the site in 8 carriages. One man held the drum he had beaten that day. Another swung a leather pouch over his shoulder. The crowds asked about its origin. Bunker Hill, he cried. Another veteran, dressed in the hat and coat he had worn during the battle, still had bullet holes visible. He carried a shot bag containing the bullets he had brought into battle that day, swinging it from left to right. Across the bay, at the foot of the hill, Lafayette helped lay a cornerstone at a Masonic ceremony. Then he refused to take his place under the covered pavilion, which was designated for the guests of honor, shielding them from the hot afternoon sun. Instead, he said he belonged among the veterans of the Revolution as a representative of the old army. He sat out there under the blazing sun, surrounded by a sea of heads with whitened or thinning hair, as silver trumpets were pressed to their ears to amplify the speakers' voices. Lafayette described Bunker Hill as his polar star, and the monument he raced across the country to help begin there was finished in 1843. An obelisk stretching 221 feet into the sky, but also, as its planners had hoped, a generational bridge linking Americans to their original benefactors. In a sense, though this was not the end of Lafayette's tour, it was the culmination. his presiding over the consecration of the memory of the Revolution, which had so rallied the nation together in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There was a rapid tour of New England, a return to New York and Philadelphia, then a time of relative quiet in Washington, a chance to travel into Virginia and say farewell to Madison, Jefferson, and Monroe. Shortly before his departure, on September 7th, Lafayette told the publisher, William Winston Seton, that he was stunned by the magic changes across America, its wealth, its population. Seton's wife, Sarah, wrote to her mother that Lafayette, in the most touching strain, spoke of the springtime of his youth, when visions of hope were strong, and which age he had seen the singular felicity of seeing realized. It's remarkable that after 2 centuries, Americans still recall this tour. Over the last year, the bicentennial of Lafayette's visit, they have gathered together, sometimes over hundreds of them, in places where he only stopped momentarily, where the landscape would be unrecognizable to anyone present then. Museums have relics, footstool, for example, they claim were part of the great celebration, sometimes with sketchy provenance. Families still tell stories, true or not, how he danced with their ancestor at a ball, or he gave her a buckle from his shoe. What kind of event could leave memories that linger so long after it had passed? A beautiful reunion, a moment of national reconciliation, and a time to reflect on the singularity of our rights and institutions and offer thanks to the men who made great sacrifices to win and build them. Men and women, I should say. So the bicentennial of Lafayette's tour has ended. I still think the story of his farewell can inform how we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It reminds us of the importance of serving causes greater than ourselves, of revering our veterans, and of the power of common memory to help us find a place to come together in shared citizenship outside of politics. And it also reminds us that our revolution is ongoing. Lafayette crossed the ocean one last time, seeking affirmation of the success of the cause for which he had fought for so long ago. And he found it. As he wrote to a fellow Frenchman, "You cannot imagine how I was struck by the miracle wrought here by 48 years of independence, instruction in government, and liberty. It surpasses my imagination, I know." But thrilled as he was by the progress he beheld, Lafayette did not ignore the areas where the American Revolution was incomplete. There's only one issue for which I am less resigned than ever, and that is slavery and anti-black prejudice, he wrote from New Orleans. But rather than scold his hosts or denigrate their achievements, Lafayette, who had long opposed slavery and searched for ways to end it, spoke by gesture. In New York, he visited the city's free school for black children. He visited in plain view with black men who had served in the Revolution and met with a battalion of free black men who had fought alongside Andrew Jackson during the Battle of New Orleans. As he told the people of Gallipolis how lucky you are to live on the northern banks of the Ohio River where slavery cannot breathe. He gently pointed out the hypocrisy of this wicked institution and a nation dedicated to the rights of man and whose freedom he had helped win. Lafayette could take incredible joy and pride in the progress he beheld across America, but also signaled to its citizens and leaders where great work remained. I think Lafayette would unapologetically argue that the world is better off because of America. And then he might confess that America has its imperfections, but he might add that the framers left behind the means for future generations of Americans to address those imperfections and to continue the work of their revolution. And in a way, that is one of the legacies of Lafayette's tour. And it's the charge of every generation of Americans, and it's the story of this nation over the last 250 years. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions, so I'm going to ask for your help since I can't reach. Whoever has a question, stand up, and I'll pass the microphone, or somebody could pass it. So who's got a question? Anybody? Don't be shy.
I read your book 2 weeks ago, and I loved it.
Thank you.
Question for you. Lafayette's dog that he lost in the when the ship went down.
Yeah.
Did he bring that from France?
No, it was a gift, I believe, from a military officer in Washington and his wife, Clara Baldwin, who we'd met in France. Lafayette had a number of young women who he had relationships with, not romantic relationships, I'm sorry, that came out out the wrong way, but he had mentor-mentee relationships. And I think she was one of them when her brother-in-law was Joel Barlow, who was the American ambassador to France for a period. So they were friends, and then he met up with her in Washington and her husband, who was a military official, and they gave the little dog to Lafayette in Washington. And so when he left on that tour of the southern and western states, the dog came with him. And then I don't know if I want to tell everyone here because we might ruin a surprise in the book, but Lafayette did have a dog with him named Quiz who traveled let's put it this way, the dog didn't make it to Ohio. Yeah. Thank you for reading the book.
Anybody else? Oh.
No, don't let her ask a question.
I'm gonna. Thank you for your talk. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process? Which archives did you go to, or how did you read his letters, or how did you research your book?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. Well, first of all, I was really lucky. I was talking to a historian recently, and he asked the same question, and I said, the Lilly Library on the campus of Indiana University, which is about 2 miles from me, has one of the nation's greatest repositories of Lafayette materials behind Cornell, Library of Congress, Cleveland State. So I didn't really have to go very far. They have a number of, actually, the percentage of Lafayette materials I accessed and looked at that are in the Lilly was probably about 20%, because they have stuff going all the way back to the Revolution, and I was focused so intensely on just these, the couple years leading up to Lafayette's return and the return. But they had great things. I looked there. I had a research assistant in New York City who went up to Cornell numerous times to find Lafayette's letters. Lafayette wrote a lot of letters home to his daughters and granddaughters, which are wonderful. They capture what he was seeing and what he was feeling. And Cornell also has letters that his secretary, Lavasseur, who I mentioned, whose journal of the trip was published in 1829, I think, and is really the primary source for understanding this part of history. Well, they had letters that he had written, and some of the contents of the letter are in the journal, the published journal. A lot of them aren't, and there's wonderful things in there about what Lafayette was feeling, his observations of what Lafayette was feeling, how everyone in the party was tired and sick about a month into the tour, but not Lafayette. He was acting like he was 20 again, and wonderful. I was actually yesterday listening to David McCullough's Brave Companions, and I was thinking one thing that's important about this book that I didn't even mention is there's a real sense of discovery in terms of natural discovery, because these Frenchmen had never seen crocodiles before. They had never seen, there were certain types of deer and geese they'd never seen before, and they were observing these things. And Lavasseur in particular was writing in his letters. And the one I loved the most, and I almost wasn't going to put it in the book, but then I had to, was when they're in Alabama, one evening he sees these lights in the forest, and they don't know what they are, and he runs out to the forest to try and catch them. And he can't catch them, and they're with a band of Creek Indians. And he says, "What are those?" And fireflies. They'd never seen them before. So those letters brought home a real sense of the journey, the emotion of it, and then also kind of the wonder that the Frenchmen had. But one last thing I'll say about your question was that at the Lilly Library, what I saw early on in my research was I came across a letter that wasn't written by Lafayette. It wasn't written by his son or James Monroe or whoever. It was a woman whose name I didn't recognize, and it was about a 5-page letter. And you know how it is when you go into the archives or libraries, you get there at noon and you think you'll get it all done in an hour, and then it's 5 o'clock and the librarians are telling you you've got 10 minutes left. And I had this letter in front of me. I thought, I don't have time to read this. But then I started looking at it. I said, I better read this just to make sure what it is. And it was a letter written by a woman in New York who had traveled from, I can't remember, it's in the book, in Buffalo or Albany down to New York City to crash Lafayette's birthday celebration on September 6, 1824. And she sneaks into the hall where it's happening, and then the guards try and kick her out. And Baroness Willett, who I mentioned in my talk, shows up and says, let the lady stay, let the lady stay. And she's writing about this whole thing. It's really interesting. And then she writes, Lafayette walks in, and she shakes his hand, and she's talking about what he looks like and what it's I can't believe I'm meeting with Lafayette. But then she digresses from there into a meditation on what it means. And I talked a little bit about this, that it's so over the top. And she's saying, this is all crazy, and it's madness, and we've all gone mad. And she questions, is this compatible with the spirit of a Republican, lower case R people? And they would have been more connected 50 years after the revolution to those than we are. And then she works her way around and says, yeah, if there's ever a time for us to lose our minds, this is it, because we have to give thanks to the veterans of the revolution. And so I thought that was such a great way to tell the story, the eyewitness account, and have an understanding what Americans were feeling here. So after that, I searched everywhere to find those letters, and there's so many of them, firsthand accounts of people who were there, whose names are lost to history, or journals, or memoirs that were written many, many years later. So that drove the book, and that all began in the Lilly Library. Thank you for the question, and thank you for coming also.
Okay. Anybody? Oh, okay.
I was wondering if you ran across any attitudes on the part of the English people with regards to Lafayette.
Yeah, there's a wonderful, when Lafayette gets to Washington in the winter, 1824, and before Congress begins to debate on the national gift, there are editorials in English newspapers about Lafayette's visit, sneering at the whole thing, at about the Americans are making fools of themselves, celebrating this man, and also everything they profess about Republican government and idolatry, they're betraying by celebrating this man in such an over-the-top way. There's wonderful, I wish I could quote verbatim for you some of these editorials in the English newspapers. Some of them are in the book, but saying the Americans are fools for celebrating him. And I think that stung. That really stung. And Jefferson, a great quote, which was a little bit before this. Jefferson says, I think writing to Monroe, says, it's great that we've invited Lafayette to come back, but we can't just have him for dinner. And the point being is that we have to disprove the English, the French, any other European power that they think that we're ungrateful by having him here, betraying our values, and not actually doing anything for him by giving him this $200,000 gift. But I think that the general attitude was they mocked him and they mocked our celebration of him.
Thanks for taking the time tonight to do this talk. One thing that came out that was a little surprising was how, I guess, forgotten the revolutionary generation was up until this return. What caused that? Then when going into, like you mentioned, Nathaniel Greene was still around, and he's no slouch of revolutionary prominence. But what was it that made it get that generation get so forgotten and this so revitalized that?
Yeah, it was actually, I would say that it was forgotten, and then there's a confluence of, in the years leading up, the immediate years leading up to Lafayette returning, there began to have a revival. Now, sometimes you write a book, and then you realize, like, something makes sense to you after the book's written. That was really important to the story. That's right in front of you. So I live in southern Indiana. I live in Monroe County. So if I drive up I live in Bloomington. If I drive up to Indianapolis, I have to go through Morgan County, which is named after Daniel Morgan, Revolutionary General. Then I get to Marion County, named after Francis Marion. If I go to the next county, I'm in Hamilton County. If I'm in Bloomington or Monroe County and I go to my west, I'm in Greene County, named for Nathaniel Greene. If I go a couple counties to my east, I'm in Fayette County, named for Lafayette. These are all named in 1819, 1820, 1821. So the immediate years leading up to Lafayette's return. So to answer your question, I think in the years immediately after the Revolution and then the ratification of the Constitution, the Independence Hall is a great metaphor. It sat there because the capital of Pennsylvania drifted westward, and it had no purpose, and a young people expanding in population, seeking wealth, growing, don't have a lot of time for thinking about their immediate past. But as we got closer to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration, and also as the revolutionary generation begins to die off, I noticed in newspapers around this time, every time that a veteran of the Revolution in a community dies, there's a big headline saying another hero gone. So it's like a watch, right? And when Lafayette, another great kind of symbolic thing is that when Lafayette gets to America, only 4 signers of the Declaration are still alive. Charles Carroll of Carrollton, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Charles Thompson. And Charles Thompson dies the day that Lafayette gets to New York. So there's a sense of anxiety, I think, about that generation passing. And then there's this presidential election, which Monroe is will be the last of that generation. Now, I was in Nashville at Andrew Jackson's home, the Hermitage. They make a point that Jackson fought in the Revolution as a boy, but he's not of the revolutionary generation. And that generation is passing, and another generation is taking over the leadership of the country and directing it into the future. And I think that provokes some anxiety, and that then in turn provokes this nostalgia just before Lafayette's arrival. So when he gets there, I say, boom, he shows up, the country's thinking about the revolution. This very special revolutionary hero, he's not like others, obviously. He came here, he spent his own money, he's disinterested in fighting for our freedom, and he hadn't been here in 40 years. He shows up, there's a big celebration, but I want to say it's not just about Lafayette, it's about everywhere he went. If you read the newspaper accounts, and there were 600 newspapers in the country at this time, which were carried on steamboats. And so accessibility of news, dissemination of information is greatly expanded by the advent of steam engine. Almost every newspaper account of where Lafayette went, an old veteran shows up. This is incredibly dramatic. I'm trying to think of a couple real quickly. When he's in Natchez, Mississippi, a man, as he's about to get on the steamboat, an old veteran steps forward, rips open his shirt, and shows him his scars. And he just says, Brandywine. This happens over and over and over again. So I think the country was feeling nostalgic. Lafayette shows up. They're incredibly excited to see him, but they're also touched to see the other veterans of the Revolution. And that's a huge part of this story, I think.
Okay, I think we're going to turn it over to the book signing. So let's thank our author again, and thank you for coming out.
Thank you.